Chapter 5 9 Sea Monsters. Hrothgar's hair, once red as fire, had turned white with worry about Grendel. His heart was sickened by slaughter. So many men had waited in Hall Heorot to face the fiend and been eaten for their courage that the king had come to think that he was being punished for his pride in building such a magnificence. He rested his jutting jaw in his hand and welcomed Beowulf without much confidence. "I knew your father," he said, after they had exchanged salutes. "He was a tall, strong man with an eye like a hawk's." Beowulf blinked and smiled. "Great Hrothgar," he said politely. "I am not tall, as you see, and my enemies liken my eyes to the bat's, but the bat knows well enough where he is going at night, and so do I." Hrothgar shook his head slowly, as though it buzzed with sorrow. "I suppose you have come to fight Grendel," he muttered. "Please go home again. There is nothing anyone can do." Beowulf sat down on the steps by the king's throne. His manner was relaxed and easy. Hrothgar could not help but liking this plain young man. There was such a simple air of simplicity about him. He shuddered and touched the scars on his own face, livid marks made by Grendel's claws, as he thought what the monster would do to that simplicity. Beowulf was eating an apple. He bit into it with cheerful determination. The tips of his fingers were square. Hrothgar noticed how strong his wrists were. Beowulf said, "Oh, these apples are good. Do you want one?" "Where did they grow?" "In the valley on the other side of the hill. I had my men pick a sackful as we marched past." Beowulf nodded to one of his followers. The man chose an apple from a huge bag he had been carrying on his back and brought it to the king. Hrothgar balanced it on the palm of his hand and considered it doubtfully. "That grove is witch work," he said, looking at Beowulf as though he expected him to turn into a pig at any minute. Unferth, slouched over a cup, rich mead sticky in his whiskers, grinned agreement. "An old witch spat her teeth out there," he muttered. "They were bad teeth, green and red and rotting. They grew into apple trees. Nobody in his right mind would eat fruit like that." Beowulf took a big bite and finished his apple, pips, core, and all. "Do you feel well?" asked the king. "Never better." "But you heard what Unferth said." "I heard." Unferth scowled and poked at his boil. "Only someone wicked could eat witches' apples and come to no harm," he insinuated darkly. Beowulf laughed. Hrothgar thought it was a long time since he had heard such a free and easy sound in Hall Heorot. "I don't like being laughed at," whined Unferth, drawing his dagger. Beowulf swiftly handed him an apple. "I don't peel them myself," he said. "Things seem to lose something when their skin's off, don't you think? But every man to his own taste." Unferth skewered the apple with his blade. Hrothgar and Queen Wealhtheow were smiling at his discomfiture. Some of the Geats scoffed, delighted by their leader's quick wit. The Danes laughed too. Unferth was unpopular, and they liked the way this mild-tempered stranger had put him in his place. Unferth could not stand it. He sliced the apple in two and kicked the pieces away. "I say what I said before," he hissed. "The apples are bad, and only a bad. The apples are good," broke in Beowulf, his voice calm but firm. "Listen, Unferth, and I will tell you something. You think that bad brings forth bad only, and that the good man should hold apart from it. I suggest things aren't so simple, so black and white. Even the wickedest person can do good for someone. The truly good man finds good where he can." "Oh, so you're truly good, are you?" sneered Unferth. "Not at all," said Beowulf. "Bad teeth don't just belong to witches. I have some myself." He opened his mouth and pointed. Unferth sniggered. "Riddled with rot," he said. "And your teeth have obviously infected your tongue. Riddles and rot. That's what your talk is." Queen Wealhtheow leaned forward. Her fair hair trembled with gold in the sunlight that streamed through the hall from a high window. "I don't think the stranger talks in riddles," she said. "What he says and does make perfect sense to me." Explain, said the king patiently, still rolling the apple in his hands. Well, said Wealtheo, I think that Beowulf is trying to show us that in order to overcome evil, we have to admit to a little bit of it in ourselves. He can eat the witch's apple and come to no harm because he has sufficient strength of character to find the good in it. Strength? Scoffed Unferth. Bat's eyes and rat's teeth? Quite so, said Wealtheo. He admits to his weaknesses, and in the admitting, they become strengths. This is no usual kind of hero. Hrothgar nodded thoughtfully. I'm inclined to agree with you, my love, although reasoning things out isn't my best point, and I can't pretend to have understood all this apple business as readily as you have. Never mind understanding, the queen said, her blue eyes patient. Just eat your apple. I'm sure it's tasty. Hrothgar crossed himself and took a bite. Everyone watched him expectantly. He took another bite. He chewed. He swallowed. He could not help thinking of the witch, but neither could he help admitting that the apple was delicious. It's fine and ripe, he said, at last, smacking his lips. Neither too sour nor too sweet. Beowulf beamed. He said, Now about Grendel. No, wait a bit, snapped Unferth. What about Brecca? Brecca? Said Hrothgar. Who's Brecca? Unferth's thin lips were wry and ugly with malice. Brecca, he said slowly, savoring each nasty word, was the name of a friend of our fine hero here. I just remembered the story while you and the queen were busy heaping incomprehensible praises on him. Not a pretty story, is it, Beowulf? You tried to drown your friend because he was a better swimmer than you. After Unferth's outburst, some of the Geats wanted to throttle him. They were so furious at this insult to their leader. But Beowulf walked among them coolly, advising restraint. Hrothgar shifted about uneasy on his throne, glaring at Unferth, wanting to apologize to Beowulf for his henchman's uncouth behavior. But Queen Wealtheo caught at his sleeve and whispered to him to wait and see what Beowulf had to say. It's a kind of test, she murmured behind her hand. So far, everything has gone the stranger's way. Let's watch how he deals with this. Beowulf came and stood before them. His face was pale. His eyes had a faraway look. He spoke with a straightforward seriousness that made everyone fall silent. His voice echoed compellingly in the hushed hall. Mighty Hrothgar, wise Wealtheo, Beowulf said. The truth is not as your man, Unferth, has told it. What happened was this. When I was a boy, I had a friend called Brecca. We both loved swimming. We used to go out together and wrestle with the waves, whatever the weather. One day, we made a dare with each other, as boys will. The dare was that each of us will enter the sea, sword in hand, and keep swimming until one gave up. Beowulf smiled, as though all this struck him as great foolishness now. If you ask me why we took swords, he went on, I can only say that we had some conceited idea of fighting whales with them. Anyway, we were both good swimmers, and we went on and on for 5 days and 5 nights, neither willing to admit defeat, until a terrible storm drove us apart. I'll never forget that moment. The sky grew dark at noon, and the wind lashed the sea until it boiled. The creatures of the deep were driven mad by the storm. Something caught a hold of me, and to this day I'm not sure whether it was a furious sea swell or some monster from the ocean bed, and dragged me towards the rocks at the foot of the cliffs, which suddenly loomed up from nowhere. I clung on hard, and I turned to face the roaring waves, and then monsters did indeed appear, 9 of them, one after another, sliding slick with jaws agape through the heaving sea. And I swung my sword about my head and fought them off. I killed them. 9 sea monsters. I killed them. The wind stopped. The waves dropped. I was on Lapland shore, exhausted and covered in seaweed, and I slept. As for Brecca, he was not drowned. The current swept him to Norway. He was a better swimmer than I. The Geats burst out cheering as Beowulf finished. They had heard the story before, of course, but never so plainly from Beowulf's lips. He was not given to boasting, and had offered his account simply as an answer to Unferth's lie. King Hrothgar was stirred by the telling of such brave deeds. He was a warrior at heart, and here was something he could easily understand and appreciate. He commanded his servants to prepare a banquet fit for a hero. The feasting and drinking went on for hours. Only Unferth did not join in. He sat in a corner, picking moodily at his boil, glaring at the bright assembled company. Long shadows crept into Hall Heorot. Night was coming on. Some of the Danes grew restless and apprehensive. They did not like to show their fear of Grendel, but their hands quivered when they were holding their drinking horns, and their eyes kept returning to the door. Hrothgar consulted with Wealhtheow, and then he said to Beowulf, "You are determined to face Grendel, come what may?" "I am," said Beowulf quietly. "What's your plan?" "The best plan," said Beowulf. "No plan." Hrothgar shook his head. "You are the bravest man I have ever met," he said, standing up to salute his guest. "If anyone can kill Grendel, it's you." He suddenly noticed something about Beowulf that had escaped his attention before. "Where's your sword?" he asked. Beowulf shrugged. "My sword? Oh, I left it in the sun somewhere. I need no sword." "No sword? But how does Grendel use a sword?" demanded Beowulf. "Well, of course not, but he will eat. Have swords been any good against him in the past?" Beowulf pursued relentlessly. Hrothgar had to admit that they had not. But he could not see how one man, however good and strong, dared face the fiend without weapons. Beowulf held up his hands. "Here are weapons enough," he said. "I put more trust in these 10 fingers than in 100 swords." Hrothgar wanted to argue. He was desperately worried now. He thought Beowulf mad. He thought it was suicide to wait for Grendel. Grendel, the murderously all-powerful, without at least a good keen blade for company. What could one man's hands hope to do to that black terror? Queen Wealhtheow silenced her husband's objections. She brought the banquet to a close, giving Beowulf a golden cup to drink from. Beowulf drank deep, his eyes not leaving hers. He handed the cup back to her and smiled as though he had taken sustenance for the deepest well in the world. Then, as the Danes were about to leave, the night already rustling at Heorot's doors, Unferth surprised them all, and perhaps himself, by saying, "I'm going to stay. I want to see what happens when this fool tries to shake hands with Grendel."